bind the back, I really don't have to wait much longer than just a couple of minutes for the top to cure, because the tape is still on there and I have plenty of time to set up. The advantages of the super glue technique, as I said in the beginning, is that it allows you to precisely cut and dry fit everything, tape it all down, and then glue it in later. So when you have a really critical seam like you have on the back, and the back is critical because you see both the seam at the heel area as well as at the tail area. So these seams have to be really good. So I'm gonna start by finding out, as I did with the top, where the binding wants to live or be happy. And then what I'll do is then I will mark where I'm gonna cut in the center of the back strip, this top seam here. Now, the back binding and purfling, I'll prepare exactly like I did the top purfling, meaning I gotta get rid of that sharp edge at the top where the tape goes over, and then this inside corner where it sits in the channel. Okay, I also did the same thing to the purfling that I did to the other side, and I'll just remove that rough edge. Okay. So essentially, with the super glue technique, you can get your seams perfect, and I started up here, and I'll work my way around to the bottom, just because I find it easier to cut that bottom seam with that little bit more of that open curve there than to do this top one. So I've got the seam at the top where I want it, so now it's just a matter of coming around and taping, just like you would tape if you were gluing it. Again, there's no glue at this point. We're just dry fitting it. Once I've got this side taped around, I'm not going to cut it off just yet. I'm going to bring the other side down to about the same position. Now, when I get down to around the middle, I'm going to mark this first piece center seam. I'm then going to mark where I want to cut the purfling at an angle, just like we did the other side. As you can see, one of the things I like about this miter box is it allows me to actually put it on the edge of the guitar to cut that joint. cut that scarf joint, I'll cut it oversized with the chisel and the hammer, like the way I showed you earlier. And then what I'll do is I'll sneak up to the final cut by hand. And to do that, I'll just hold the chisel at an angle and then very, very carefully take off a sliver of wood. Until it's perfect. And it is. Now we have to cut the final seam. Which is the binding. Once again, I'm gonna cut it a little bit oversized, and then I'm gonna sneak up to the final fit using a sandpaper block like I did on the other side. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll cut it in the miter box. Sometimes that sticks just a little bit, and you have to be very careful because you don't want to chip out. There we go. So we're oversized. Now what I have to do is I have to trim it to fit. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna attach the purfling first. And we already know that that is a good fit. Okay, so I'm gonna put a piece of tape on that. No, not really. I gotta bring this down. Okay. So now what we have to do is we have to sneak up and get that to meet. What I'll do is I'll get as close as I can with the chisel and then I'll sweeten it up with sandpaper. And very carefully sweeten it to where it meets. Take your time with this because getting a good seam here is the hallmark of a custom-made guitar. Okay, I'm gonna tape it because undoubtedly I will have to remove a hair more at that seam because if it pushes too tight against this, you're gonna get a gap here. Hopefully that isn't too bad. That looks good. And that scarf joint looks perfect. So I'm good to go. I'm gonna finish taping it. And make sure that scarf joint is good. And that looks good. Well, we're a little bit tight on this side, so I'm gonna have to redo that seam. Yep, I gotta remove a little bit more of wood here because, again, if this pushes in too hard against that butt joint here, you're gonna get a gap here. And I'd rather have a little bit of a touch-up to do there than to have a big gap here. Well, actually, now that I'm looking at it, it probably isn't too bad. I'm gonna go with it. Okay, so let's finish taping. Again, that waist is a critical area. You want to use plenty of tape in the waist. And we are good to go, and we can start gluing. I'll be locking down the binding and the purfling with thin super glue. But I want to just make a couple caveats about using super glue. The main issue with using super glue on binding and purfling is that where you have a seam right here, as you all know, that super glue wicks into end grain very quickly and very far. And what it does is it makes a dark glue line, which is unsightly. And trust me, I've seen enough of that, particularly with maple binding, to almost want to take the binding off and redo it. But this is a tip that my good friend Michael Bashkin showed me in a recent seminar sort of class that he did on binding a guitar. What we're going to do is we're going to lock down these seams with just regular glue that we used on the other side. That will keep those seams together, but won't allow that super glue to get in and wick in and make a dark glue line. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to take these little brushes. I think they're beauty brushes, they're mascara type brushes or whatever, but they're very, very thin brushes. And I'm going to take those and I'm going to get a little bit of white glue for this tight bond on the edge of that paper cup there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the tape off and put that glue in the seam here and where I did that scarf joint. Okay, so the scarf joint is right here. I'm not going to pull it up. Well, I will have to pull it up actually. The scarf joint is right here. Okay? And then the seam is there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little brush and I'm just going to get a little dab of glue on there and I'm going to put it in that scarf joint seam right there. Okay? And then I'm going to take the same glue and put it right here on this seam. Okay, so that seam's done. I can pull my tape back up and just make sure that everything's lining up good, which it is. And I'm going to put my tape back down. Cut. Seam 1. We do the same thing down here. Finally, as I did on the other side, before I put the glue on, I'm just going to knock down and make sure that binding is seated really well. And one of the benefits of this technique is it really allows you to check your work and make sure that all your seams, all your bindings, gap-free, all the way around, and we are looking good. I'm going to push it down just a bit here. And so on and so on. Just go around the entire perimeter of the guitar. Make sure everything's locked down. You can take a little break before we apply the super glue. Let this glue right here set up for about 5 or 10 minutes before you apply the super glue. Once again, we're going to use thin viscosity super glue. It's the StuMac. I don't know what the model number is, but it ends with a 10. And I don't apply it from the bottle with a tip. I like to use these pipettes because it allows me to get it exactly where I want it. The idea with this is not to make a mess with it, to lock it down. You don't want to drench or really run a lot of super glue in this binding channel here, because what it can do is it can drip down the sides inside the guitar and make a really bad looking inside of the guitar. So what I do, I like these pipettes. What I'll do is I'll just start between the tape and just run a little bit of glue. Again, I'm not drenching it. And again, one of the reasons you can get away with this technique on the back is that you don't get that stain reaction on usually your hardwoods and your back and sides woods. This is mahogany. I've done this plenty of times. I know it's not going to do anything, but I've never had a problem with maple, rosewood, any of the hardwoods. It's only the softer spruce woods that are used for tops where you can get that green staining. So I'll just go around in between the tape and run a little bit of glue. Now I noticed a little gap there, so I'm going to close that up. Good. So what we'll do is we'll let that dry about 15 minutes. We'll come back. Again, I didn't use any accelerator on it. And then what we'll do a second application, and then I'll start removing the tape and putting the super glue in between where the tape was covering the area. So after the first application of your super glue, I wait about 15 minutes. Then I pull up the tape, and then using the pipette, put a little bit more super glue in the purfling and the binding to get them both seated. Now, if you do have a problem area, a gap or something that hasn't closed up, it's pretty simple to just take a clamp, or you can even use your fingers sometimes, But in this case, I have a little bit of a spring back from that area at that seam. So I'll just put a clamp on it. Then I can drop a bit of super glue in there. And then what I'll do this time, I'll accelerate it. Now it's dry, pretty much, and you can take your clamp off, you can take the tape off, and then we'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you the binding job that we did on both the back and the front. When you pull the tape off the top, be very careful. Even though you have shellac on there, it's really important that you pull that tape off slowly and at a diagonal, just like that. If you get a hunk of spruce removed from that top with that tape, unless you can sand it out, it's really hard to fix. So be careful. So I removed all the tape and I'm checking for gaps, and I gotta tell you, I'm really happy with everything, the way it turned out. It's nice and tight. I know that I'm not gonna have a lot of problems when I go into the finishing stage. But what I wanted to show you was this little area here that we did the scarf joint. I've scraped away a little bit of the purfling, and basically it's really hard to find the gap. And same thing on the back. Right here, I think, let's see, where did I have that? I had it somewhere around here. Well, anyways, if you have to go looking forward, the rule is that it's probably a really good seam. So that's how you do a really good binding job. The next step is to scrape the bindings flush and then get it ready for installing the neck, and then it goes off to the finishing room. Thanks for watching this whole procedure. I hope you learned something. Signing off. This is the maple guitar that we were using in the beginning of this series of sequences on binding, where I showed you how to prep and level the sides. I didn't show the binding on this one because, as I said, it's a cutaway, and there's some certain things that you have to do differently when you do cutaways in your binding. Just like the one that we bound, I would bind the top using tight bond glue. I would not get super glue anywhere near spruce. The top on a cutaway is bound pretty much the same way that you would bind the other body, because this joint right here that is, got to be seen correctly, is covered by the fingerboard extension. So you can be a little bit sloppy and it's really not going to show anyways. You do have to get this end seam down here, and so I would do the purfling the same way that I did the other body. I would do a scarf joint there. The back is a little different, and once again, you can do it the way that I did the other body with the super glue, because this miter joint right here is very visible. Nothing covers it up. And if you have to do purfling on this, I didn't. I just used the straight binding because the purfling didn't look good. But if you do purfling on this, what I would do is I would glue the purfling on first, and I would get this miter here exact, and then I would use some of that Teflon sacrificial or fake binding, if you want to call it, to then glue that purfling down, let that dry, and then I would come back and then glue the regular binding on. And once again, I would start up here and get this miter joint perfect, and then do the back seam last, because it's a lot easier to cut that than to come up here and try and cut perfect miters when this binding is installed. So basically, that's the way that I do a cutaway, whether it be a Venetian like this one or a Florentine. Florentine obviously is a lot more trickier because particularly if you have purflings, there's a lot of mitering and going on. Makes it very hard to do. But nonetheless, you pretty much follow the same procedure when binding a cutaway that you do a regular guitar. Now, there's a lot of things in guitar making that'll make you really nervous. Cutting binding channels is one. Buffing a guitar is another one. Chances of things that going haywire are exponentially greater at that point. But one of the more enjoyable things I find about guitar making is scraping the binding after you get it installed, particularly when you do a good job, like I'm sure you'll do when you watch these videos. I like the StewMac heavy duty scraper. I used to use standard scrapers a lot. These type thin card scrapers. I grew up with these when I learned to do woodworking, but I started using these after I saw a bunch of people that I know use them, and these are well worth the money. If you do get the scraper, I do urge you to get the mini grinder with it. It makes life a lot easier. But as I said, this is one of the more enjoyable things in guitar making. Now, I'm holding the guitar on my vacuum fixture, and I've got the vacuum turned off so you can hear me talk. Otherwise, you'd be hearing it run. But when you scrape, well, it's something that you can do almost all day and really enjoy it. Plus, you gotta love those fluffy little shavings that you get. So, I hope you learned something in this video about at least how I do binding. I've given you some tips, some tricks, some shortcuts. I hope your next binding job goes a lot easier once you watch these videos. Thanks, and I'll see you on the flip side. The hallmark of doing a good binding job is when you scrape, and after 3 or 4 scrapes, your binding, your lamination line, and the sides are all level. That's when you know that you've got good binding skills down.